The British at the height of empire would be incredibly impressed that this level of destruction could be wrought on a region for so little investment by the United States, but also they would be horrified, honestly, because I think what we've done to these nominal countries and the people of the Middle East, honestly, more sweeping and devious than what the British did. I mean, I feel like it would almost be nicer if we just came in and took over everything, as Donald Trump had suggested.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
I'm doing great, Rory. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I've got a new camera, so if you're watching this on Spotify or YouTube, I hopefully will be in higher resolution or a bit sharper.
I didn't think about that. Yeah, you do look a little more hyper real.
Yes.
I've
recently found out that my phone can double as a webcam.
Oh, I'll be darned.
And it seems to be much better than the old Logitech I was using. So that's a little extra for the visual listeners.
I'll be darned. I got a new camera myself, and I'm a little intimidated. Well, this is laughable actually, but I was recording up until a couple of weeks ago on this like circa, I don't know, 2005 sort of Handycam thing.
Yeah.
And then I dropped it. And it is barely functionable. So I was like, I got whatever like they recommended on YouTube. This is what the new camera is.
It's like a little GoPro.
Yeah, it's Chinese, so they now have
is it
all of my cell phone.
Is it
DJI?
Yeah, DJI moved in.
Yeah, but it's just extraordinary, and of course the picture quality is much better, so that's something to look forward to. But it's just kind of extraordinary that like going from this to this, it
is strange. That was the big recommendation.
Yeah, but I mean, who knows? I'm famously a bit of a lazy consumer, so we'll see how it goes.
So you can do action blogs now when you're skiing and all sorts.
Yes, yeah. There's like a whole hookup, so I can fasten it to my helmet or something. But I don't know. I'm not too sure.
But your old camera reminded me of something that managed to sneak footage of the first Gulf War out of America, and I think it went to. He was a British guy that kind of just tagged along with a bunch of American soldiers for the first Gulf War, and managed to show what that war was like. Does that remind you of anything you'd like to talk about today with American Empire?
Well, I'd love to hear more about that particular anecdote. So this is someone who was embedded and got footage out that they didn't want, that the U.S. military
not
didn't want to
necessarily
get
that
out?
they didn't want, but it was back when it was obviously like, as we know with warfare today, Israeli soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers just film themselves, and quite often mainstream media just sort of goes, oh yeah, this thing off Telegram was true, or the likes. But back then, if you're in a war, it was very hard to get involved if the powers that be didn't want you to.
That's a very interesting thing, because I hadn't really thought about that. It was a brief moment in the 2000s where there was more control over the visuals that got out, because famously during the Vietnam War, journalists were allowed to go anywhere they wanted. They could do whatever and that, I think, probably accurately played a serious role in how unpopular the Vietnam War became. So the Pentagon, when they were launching the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, they said, hey, you know what? We're going to do this thing where journalists get to sign up officially and embed in military. So actually that moment in 2003 was sort of the last moment where a war-fighting government could clamp down and control what the media picture of that war was. That wasn't the case in the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s, and this was sort of one of the Pentagon's only lessons learned was, let's just not let anybody see anything that's really happening, which is thankfully no longer an option for the world's militaries. Just, hey, that's great. We're starting off with something positive, because this is not a positive.
No,
we're talking specifically about the U.S. and the Middle East over the past 40 years in the context of what we were talking about last episode, which is the real Thucydides trap, which is essentially the consolidation and frankly, the moral collapse of U.S. empire as it consolidates. I was reading this book, America's Fatal Leap by Paul W. Schroeder. It's a very, very interesting book, which we're actually is not the topic of today's discussion. I may want to do an episode on it when it's finished, but it's published by Verso Press, which is a famously left-wing, I think it
Okay.
is an explicitly left-wing press. However, Paul W. Schroeder is a American religious conservative who published primarily in his sort of, I think, late 60s, 70s, and 80s. He published in a magazine called The American Conservative at the end of a long career as a diplomatic historian. But he was so appalled by what the Bush administration was doing that he felt, and even what the first Bush administration was doing, that he felt compelled to write a series of very fascinating, honestly kind of heartbreaking essays about world order and what the Bush family's wars were doing to the potential of world order. The reason this is being collected years later, I think he died in 2016, years after his death, by a left-wing press is because he has become renowned for being almost clairvoyant.
Has the book come out recently, or did it come out ages ago and people kind of forgot about it?
It's just published.
Okay,
Just
wow.
published by Verso Press. He writes something in 1991, essentially forecasting how bad the Gulf War involvement would be. He writes something in 2001, talking about, no matter how justified we are going into Afghanistan, it's going to go poorly. And he wrote something in 2003, talking about how it was going to destroy American prestige, and essentially everything that he wrote came to pass exactly. But what really struck me and jumped out at me and made me want to do this episode was just how just 20 years ago and 30 years ago, the Middle East seemed like a place with independent actors that we had to care about, that we had to be concerned about, that had governments that were certainly not representative. The Middle East has never had that other than Tunisia. Certainly had some sovereignty that had to be respected, some power that had to be catered to, some moral force that had to be factored into U.S. calculations, and none of that exists anymore. It's just, I was just thinking about this, like, we talk a lot about comparisons between the U.S. empire and British empire and empires that may have come before. And I can't think, even at the height of 19th century European imperialism, it's hard to think of a area of the world that is more abjectly on its knees, disrespected and destroyed than the modern Middle East is today. And that's a very strong thing to say, because, I mean, on paper, there are a number of independent sovereign states that have seats at the United Nations in the Middle East, but none of them matter anymore. And the United States and Israel aren't pretending that they matter anymore. Like, this is just the complete humiliation of the Arab world. And this sort of gets to the Thucydides trap. It is interesting. My version of this Thucydides trap, which is American consolidation turning allies into peons and just sort of crushing and humiliating them more and more. The Middle East is the most extreme version of this. Yes, obviously, there is Israel, which we will not be able to avoid discussing, and we can't avoid discussing anymore, and is a key part of U.S. subjugation of the region. But the allies of the United States, very formal, very, subsidized allies of the United States, like all of the Gulf monarchies and Jordan and Egypt, are just pitiful excuses for sovereign countries. And 20 years ago, they seemed like, certainly they were dependent in some ways. Certainly they were weaker than the United States or the Soviet Union, but they had more cards to play, and they played them. The Middle East right now is, on the one hand, you've got U.S. allied Israel that is just, seems to be successfully warring on 6 separate countries at once. And then on the other side, you have U.S. Potemkin states in the Gulf that are not just running roughshod over rights across the Middle East, but across North Africa and into West Africa and even more broadly. The British would be incredible. The British at the height of empire would be incredibly impressed that this level of destruction could be wrought on a region for so little investment by the United States, but also they would be horrified, honestly, because I think what we've done to these nominal countries and the people of the Middle East is honestly more sweeping and devious than what the British did. I mean, I feel like it would almost be nicer if we just came in and took over everything, as Donald Trump had suggested, because we've turned the fiction of sovereignty and nationalism into this. Simply put, Rory, like I was really
Horrified.
just to think about
Well,
how
you're
much.
someone that probably assumed a lot of these things before, but has this taken you to a whole new level of despair about the Middle East?
I honestly think it has, just because it's really just reckoning with specifically Israel's actions over the past couple weeks, specifically their treatment of Syria, which was nominally sort of the last sovereign, anti-US serious Arab country. We launched a massive war against them in 2011, utilizing some very earnest and authentic people who hated the truly evil Assad regime. But yeah, we'd sort of, been crushing that country for a decade. The evil regime finally fell. And yes, very distasteful people that we had sponsored took over. And those people have done everything they possibly can to, frankly, kiss Israel's ass. Israel has responded by destroying their military, invading the country, straight up Vladimir Putin style, invading the country. And now they've been announcing that an entire southern region of Syria has to be a demilitarized zone, or they'll start bombing and attacking even further. And it's just, I always knew and talked about how the supposed axis of resistance to Israel was kind of, served more Israeli purposes than they did the people who were resisting. It wasn't particularly serious, but it is just the way that everything that these Middle Eastern countries, both opposed to Israel and allied with the United States, because for every Arab government, there has been the promise has been, if you ally with the United States and make some kind of peace with Israel, Israel's going to calm down. And instead, Israel's gotten, much more genocidal and has basically essentially torn up every agreement it's ever made. It had an agreement with Syria on not further invading Syria. They are further invading Syria. Israel and Washington, D.C. are talking a ton about how Egypt is apparently violating some aspects of the Camp David Accords because they're moving military forces into places that were, prior, were meant to be less militarized. But of course, one of the key aspects of the Camp David Accords is that the people of Gaza are not going to be ethnically cleansed. So yeah, this is not Egypt that that started this.
But I seen an AI thing that showed Gaza looking great.
Oh, good to hear.
Did you not see that? I think it was a White House official. Donald Trump put it out.
The Mar-a-Lago on the Mediterranean. Yeah, no, I've been avoiding as much of that as possible.
What has been the real reason for so much destruction in the Middle East caused by America?
The United States wants to bomb things. And the United States has cherished and carefully crafted continued instability in the Middle East. I did a video on the channel talking about how while Taiwan and Ukraine are obviously much more attractive than Israel, it's the same deal. We do the same thing everywhere. We find, in the 1990s, we had way too much peace to maintain the military component we did. So we quite consciously crafted narratives on the borders of Russia, on the borders of China, and in the Middle East that allowed us to continue to be armed up. And that was, quite straightforward. Absolutely. Both the Republican and Democratic parties are in hock to Israel in ways that are quite shameful. But I think that's a subsidiary issue to our lust for destruction and our lust for instability everywhere. And it really, this state of affairs does not serve Israel. The the whirlwind that is going to be reaped, whether it's in the 2020s or in the 2080s, is going to lead to the destruction of Israel. I mean, there was a point in the 1990s where wise men who were in charge of Israel realized that in order to truly solidify Israel's location, it had to make peace with its neighbors. It had to make peace with the Palestinians. They killed that guy. The Israelis assassinated that guy, and people who celebrated that are now in the Israeli government. These morons are not going to maintain a viable Israel in the decades and half century to come if they wipe out all the Palestinians. The Palestinians are essentially the human shields for Israel. If there are no Palestinians in the world of nuclear weapons technology, Israel's, maybe they'll last a couple decades, but eventually somebody will wipe it off the face of the planet. The Palestinians are what Israel needs to continue to survive. In the centuries to come, there needs to be a Palestine right next to Israel. If there isn't, there will eventually, inevitably, not be an Israel anymore.
Do you mean that Israel will start to invade its neighbors and take off too much? Say this Trump deal goes through and slowly the rest of Palestine is dissolved away. What then happens?
Well, what happens is Israel wins in our lifetimes. I'm not talking about
anytime soon.
Yeah, I'm not talking about anytime soon. Israel clearly is committed to genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, and that is the stupidest possible course of action to take if you want a truly long-lasting home for the Jewish people. If you want a long-lasting home for the Jewish people, you need a lot of Palestinians living right next door to you. If you do what they're doing now, which is work very hard towards genocide, continue to expand into Syria, they're definitely talking about expanding into Egypt, you get to the point where eventually, not saying in the 2020s or the 2050s or the 2080s, but certainly within the next century or so, somebody with a nuclear weapon is going to say, well, there's none of our guys are there anymore. And that's it. That's the end of the Jewish homeland. This idea that what Israel is up to right now serves Israel is insane to me. What it serves is the U.S. lust for instability and the U.S. urge to destroy, to sell bombs. This is not some innate part of the U.S. character. This is an innate part of U.S. government as it is currently constituted. And of course, Elon Musk and Doggy and Trump are currently sweeping out the last vestiges of U.S. government that aren't about instability and destruction in service of being able to expand the military aspects of U.S. government even more.
But there was too much corruption in the Parks Department, Rob. We really need to get rid of that.
Yeah.
But also give 200-pound bombs. Is it 2,000-pound bombs to Israel?
2,000-pound bombs, yeah.
Yeah. Because it's hard to believe that Joe Biden was holding back any weapons, but apparently so.
No, I mean, he famously it was like one contract that he was sort of holding back a bit of that was easily substituted by a range of other things. While, there was one contract he was holding back while he was giving Israel everything it needed to do to destroy southern Lebanon and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I've clearly said everything I need to say about just how depressing this Israeli aspect is. But I think it's more interesting to look at just this whole trajectory, and that's really what I found so horrifying is, in the 1940s, the 1950s, through really the 1990s, the Middle East was just another post-imperial region. And there were, as there were everywhere in the world, leaders that reacted very strongly to, the post-imperialness. There were dictators, there were monarchs, there were very few real attempts at democracy. There were a few here and there, but it was normal, frankly. That's just what happens in post. And of course, throughout the period of independence, they had the sort of thorn in their side of Israeli imperialism. That's just sort of a given that did make things a little bit worse. But really, up until the 1990s, it wasn't significantly worse than Africa. By the 1990s, it was becoming clear that the previous truly problem child region of the Cold War, Southeast Asia was sort of cleaning up its act. You know, Vietnam was rising, people were making peace everywhere. It wasn't just one or two countries in Asia that were doing well. Everywhere in Asia, you actually had real economies, sovereign state. Like by the 1990s, it was becoming clear that the Middle East was falling behind in a serious way. This was also becoming clearer as Eastern Europe became free and mostly part of the European Union. But up until like 1980s, 1990s, it was just.
But do you think that was because you still had the Soviet Union to kind of focus a lot of America's attention on?
I think that's definitely part of the story, no question. And that the United States was more deferential to the needs and even the hyper-nationalist concerns of people in the region. The most famous example would be, I think, the point at which the United States won the Cold War, which is the Suez Crisis in 1956. If there was no Soviet Union to compete with, Dwight D. Eisenhower would have definitely let France, the coalition of France, Britain, and Israel, the very explicitly imperialist coalition of France, Britain, and Israel. It's funny how when they mention the wars of Israel's founding, 1956 always gets strange.
Forgotten about.
You had 1948, 1967, 1973. Strangely, they never mention 1956, where Israel got together with the imperial powers to try to conquer Egypt. Strangely, that just doesn't make it into the narrative, Rory. But Eisenhower basically, because of the contrast of deciding to not allow Britain, France, and Israel to reconquer Egypt, that contrast with the Soviet Union rolling the tanks into Hungary kind of forever destroyed the illusion that the Soviet Union was in any way less imperial or, more pro-independence than the United States was. One of the smartest moves by a U.S. president ever, and I would say sort of the real end of the Cold War as a functional ideological competition. It was only the incredible U.S. misstep of Vietnam that sort of kept things limping on for another couple decades. So, back then, this is to your point, the United States was interested in catering to ideas of sovereignty and freedom and independence from actors in the Middle East because they wanted to compete with the Soviet Union. And yes, you're 100% right. That was sort of why the Middle East kind of looked like everybody else into the early 1990s. By the 1980s, the United States decided for two reasons that it wanted to get into the Middle East in a bigger way. This is actually called the Carter Doctrine, essentially saying that nobody was allowed to take over an oil state, other than the United States, of course. This was in response to the oil crisis. Between the 1970s and the 2010s, the United States was actually dependent on Middle Eastern oil to keep its consumption levels up. That is no longer the case, which makes it a particularly an even larger moral atrocity that we have crushed the Middle East to the extent that we have. And also, I'd say a little bit more justifiable, though kind of geographically illiterate, the fact that the Soviets had rolled into Afghanistan in 1979, made everybody super worried about the Gulf, though if you look at a map, there's a little bit
of distance.
Yes. And the Soviets famously were not able to successfully really conquer Afghanistan at any point and did not move beyond. But that was part of the justification for the formation of CENTCOM. CENTCOM got a lot to do. I'm not sure if it was actually formally named CENTCOM yet in the 1980s, but it sort of got its start helping Saddam Hussein destroy the Iranian Navy and helping extricate Saddam Hussein from the Iran-Iraq war that he had started.
CENTCOM founded 1983.
1983. All right. So there were four runners of CENTCOM under Jimmy Carter, but the actual formal naming of the
United States Central Command, so that's their sort of Middle East branch.
Yep, and into Central Asia. So Afghanistan and Iraq were both run by CENTCOM. So that was sort of the very significant. I think Lloyd Austin and Jim Mattis, Joe Biden and Donald Trump's first secretaries of defense, part of their pathway to power was being the head of CENTCOM. And still being the head of CENTCOM is one of the most important roles in the United States military. So the foundation of CENTCOM in the 1970s, 1980s, instantly the United States was much more involved. I think there might be the naval base in Bahrain might predate this era, but from this point, the U.S. military, and especially in the 1990s, and that's kind of an extraordinary thing. Supposedly U.S. military presence being all over the world is a Cold War thing. Up until the fall of the Soviet Union, there were very few U.S. military personnel in this region. Now there are tens of thousands on a more or less permanent basis. We complain a lot about the hundreds or low thousands of troops in Iraq and Syria, but far more significant are the fives or tens of thousands of troops in naval base at Bahrain. Qatar has a huge, I think CENTCOM headquarters is in Florida, but the local headquarters is in Qatar. There's tons of U.S. troops in Kuwait. These troops move around, but these bases are very, very active, very expensive installations of the U.S. government.
But according to Peter Zeihan, America hasn't had as many troops not abroad since the 20s.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. A mix of misrepresentation and just flat ignorance. There's no question that as the United States focused more on Ukraine during the Biden administration, the troop counts in Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain went down, but there was always the capacity to jack those up quite quickly. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised what with the recent Israel stuff that there's much more going on. But so in 1980s, this sort of dynamic started, and Saddam Hussein, sort of the last truly, this is interesting. In the run up to the Gulf War, there was a serious concern that Saddam Hussein could beat the U.S. military.
Oh, really?
Yes, and that sounds ridiculous, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also considered when that war took place, it was like, oh, America is much more ahead than anyone ever thought. It just wiped the floor with them.
But Saddam Hussein had the second biggest military in the world, or the third biggest military in the world. He had all these tanks, he had all this stuff, he had all the same kinds of crap that the United States claims are still what real militaries are made out of. He had fighter jets, he had planes, because he had a very experienced military because of the Iran-Iraq war that U.S. allies had subsidized, specifically Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. So Saddam Hussein sort of provided the excuse for the United States to become much more involved. First, his invasion of Kuwait. We kicked him out, and then we garrisoned for that region for the 1990s until 2003, when we took him out, and have been stationing troops in Iraq and Syria ever since. And that's kind of just that alone, the fact that U.S. troops have been stationed in Iraq and Syria pretty much unbroken between 2003 and today, it's pretty extraordinary to me that people can talk about falling U.S. influence in the Middle East when we have been, Iraq and Syria are essentially the heart of Arab lands, and they have never had fewer than 2,000 U.S. troops controlling the territory in an adversarial relationship with the Syrian government for a decade. The new Syrian government is certainly not happy about Israel taking its territory, taking its land. But even with all of that, they're not talking about trying to get rid of the U.S. military presence yet. So it is the Iraqi government, probably the closest thing to a electoral democracy that the region has at this point. They have real elections that have some significance, but it's kind of Lebanon-centered, where it's a very sort of prescribed group of conceivable actors. The elected Iraqi government has formally asked the United States to leave on at least 3 occasions at this point, and we're still there. So in 1990, you had a region with a lot of dictators that sucked. I'm not here to make the case for them, but that seemed like real actors. I have people who make great cases that before the Iran-Iraq war, and maybe even during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a real middle class in Iraq that was being built up. There was more than just horror and destruction in these countries. Yes, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was a terrorist. Saddam Hussein was a violent authoritarian. But these were countries to be reckoned with. Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan, had an independent foreign policy from the United States, which is frankly today unimaginable. The Arab governments of today all are required to pay lip service to caring about the Palestinians because they have to retain their dictatorial power in these countries. But beyond that, there's no pretense of having any division from the United States and its requirements at all. Back in 1990, and this was part of the process. So it's 1990, the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union didn't fall until 91 or 92, but the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was really okay, this is pretty much done. Saddam Hussein thinks he can take Kuwait now. There's some argument that, he thought he had permission. The leaders of both Yemen and Jordan thought that, well, we can sort of pick or choose. And certainly, I don't know if Saleh, but certainly King Hussein wasn't a fan of his friend Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, but he thought he could sort of settle the problem amicably, and he maintained some neutrality and tried to be like the man in the middle. Saleh made the same case, and both Yemen and Jordan were heavily, heavily punished for that. Both of these countries were really dependent on aid from the United States and Saudi Arabia. I've made the case in videos that really the point at which Yemen went truly downhill was when Saleh, the leader of Yemen, attempted to just temporize, just sort of be like, hey, why don't we all work things out and not be massively against Saddam Hussein in 1990? And then all of the U.S. aid was cut and 1 million workers were kicked out of Saudi Arabia and essentially sent to Yemen as refugees. And Yemen has really never recovered from that blow, frankly. That's what happened when the Cold War ended in the Middle East. Everywhere else, the United States was like, okay, we'd maintained all these horrific genocidal civil wars in Central America. But, in the 1990s, we're like, it's fine. Let's give up. Let's have an election. Let's move on. It was the case in Asia. Our pet dictators in Asia, fell like bowling pins across the 1990s, and we were fine with it. Even in Africa, we were like, the Somalia dictator, the Congo dictator, let's get rid of it. No, in the Middle East, with the end of the Cold War, we were cracking the whip harder. Jordan was so knocked on its knees by the lack of aid and support that it had become reliant upon, that it actually was kind of forced into making a peace deal with Israel in 1994. That was sort of the only way it could get back into the U.S.'s good graces. Yemen wasn't going to do that, so it never really got back into the U.S.'s good graces until 2001, when, Saleh and the United States sort of fell into a mutual swindle that I've documented at very sad length in videos on the channel. So yeah, that's sort of where we were in 1990. But still, there was Egypt, the historic leader of the Arab world. There was Syria under the Assad family. And, some hope that the new Assad would be better than the old Assad that was crushed. And then we get to 9/11, and U.S. military involvement dramatically steps up. We get to 2003. And it's interesting, in 2003, everybody in the Middle East, as with almost everybody in Europe, was against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it just didn't matter at all. It wasn't even a consideration. It just wasn't a thing.
Because didn't even Germany and stuff kind of fall out with America at the time?
Absolutely. Germany, France, and Russia got together at the United Nations to condemn what the United States was doing. And frankly, I think 1990 kind of proved it. But by 2003, it was very, very clear that the United States had a completely free hand in the Middle East, which of course means that we are to some extent responsible for all the horror that has ensued over the past 22 years. What do we care? Let's just make things worse. The Arab Spring, Hosni Mubarak, I think, was still kind of a guy you had to reckon with, and had a long history of working with the United States that he could point to, and was an independent actor who certainly was the U.S.'s guy after sort of the assassination of Sadat, but what was was a powerful entity. The Arab Spring gets us to very vanishingly brief year and a half or 2 years of democracy in Egypt, followed by Sisi, a guy with zero legitimacy, completely propped up by the Gulf monarchies. And that's where we've been for the past decade. And it's amazing, Rory, that I can look back at Hosni Mubarak and be like, gee whiz, sure was great when Egypt had some modicum of independence and dignity. And of course, I'm speaking about a staggeringly weak, I mean, really just the trajectory of Egypt since independence. Egypt nominally became independent in the 1920s, but was still very much part of the British Empire. Real Egyptian independence was 1952 officers' coup, and then the 1956 Suez Crisis under Nasser. And Nasser, who was in power in Egypt from I'm not sure, there might have been some shaking out between 52 and 56, but up until his death in 1970, was a true international icon of unaligned power, of standing up against the United States and the Soviet Union. He was a figure to be reckoned with. Sadat, his successor, who made peace with Israel and was assassinated for it, was a weaker, but certainly an interesting figure. Hosni Mubarak was a significantly weaker figure, but had some independent power, from 1980 until 2011. And Sisi is just a bought and paid for Gulf clown. He is a subsidiary of a subsidiary. He's been colonized by the colonized. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia fund everything about his regime. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are obviously protectorates of the United States.
Do you think there's a hatred of Muslims in the American government? Because it just seems to be Muslim countries always losing.
Absolutely, that's been sort of inculcated, and you've got to, because if you look at this honestly, at what the United States, Israel, and the Gulf monarchs have been doing to these regions, most explicitly in the Middle East, but also sort of Arab-ish lands in North Africa, you have to either be horrified, start acknowledging what a monstrous country your own country is, or you have to make up all kinds of ideas about, oh, Arabs and Muslims are evil and stupid and they can't do anything and they're incapable of doing anything better. Of course, we have the example of the extraordinary result of the Arab Spring was Tunisia. There are certainly Tunisians who would come up in the comments telling me they're not Arab, they're Berber, but it is, in fact, in its own propaganda, an Arab country, a Muslim country that had a flourishing democracy for 10 years and did not get a dime from the United States and Europe, except to bulk up their military for counterterror purposes that then turn around and killed the democracy. So, yeah, it is documented fact that Arabs are not different from anybody else in the world, can absolutely do democracy and whatnot. But I'd be surprised, Rory, if most of the foreign policy people who are Middle East experts, are even aware that the decade-long Tunisian democratic experiment happened, because it is not in the interests of the United States in instability.
It doesn't feed into the narrative.
It doesn't feed in the narrative. And it also, if the Tunisian example had been allowed to succeed, if it had been funded, Rory, at the same level that Europe and the United States are now funding the new Tunisian dictatorship, it would have been successful. It could have potentially spread to Libya. It could have potentially spread to Algeria and completely demolished this idea, this racist idea that Arabs can't do democracy.
But I was also thinking about a thing with the German elections coming up and them talking about, all the young people are going to the right-wing parties. I was under the impression, I was like, is all of these waves of refugees all America's fault? Because it seems to be quite often America wrecking the Middle East, which causes a huge amount of refugees that then head to Europe.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and so the costs have been immense.
So it's this idea that, all these horrible Muslims, you're like, yeah, but if America just stopped killing everyone, then they wouldn't want to leave their homes.
100%. And you can see this tension. Europe, like as a lot of our Gulf lackeys, like Qatar as well, are really, really, really interested in bringing back some stability to Syria So, maybe they can't send all the Syrians back, but at least people will stop coming. So Europe has lifted or at least qualified a lot of its sanctions against Syria, and the United States refuses. And it doesn't matter if Europe, we saw this recently, Qatar had volunteered in the first weeks and months of the first weeks of the new Syrian government. Qatar had said, you know what, we'll fund the government salaries to keep Syria stable and, avoid the horrors of Iraq in 2003. And it came out this week that they can't do that because U.S. sanctions.
Wow.
Which is actually a great illustration of what I've been saying about U.S. sanctions the whole time. It doesn't matter what anybody says if U.S. maintains the sanctions. So Europe has a very clear interest Brexit happened because the United States destroyed the Middle East, because of the refugee flows that came from that. Europe has a real interest in the success of this new Syrian government, and the United States is blocking it at every turn. And just the spectacle of the Syrian government right now, we worked very hard for a decade to overthrow Assad. We have overthrown Assad, and we are doing everything we can to make sure that this new Syrian government fails. It's quite extraordinary.
What can you see in, the next 10 years for the Middle East?
Either horrific revolution and war or continued immiseration. We have provided no other options. There is no, the Abraham Accords. Come on, it is basically deals between U.S. client states that are responsible for the immiseration of the region. There is no, Saddam Hussein really was the last gasp of any kind of independent thinking or sovereignty in that region, and he was demonized, destroyed, and hung. And not that, Saddam Hussein was a monster, of course.
Yeah.
But
but also he worked heavily with the Americans, and then they betrayed him.
Well, of course. This is apparently our approach. But it's just the idea that, as I think you mentioned earlier, was this in the last episode, that Peter Zeihan can come out and be like, the United States has left the Middle East, and it's just what are you smoking? What is your infantile misunderstanding of what an empire is?
He's comparing it to the 1920s, but there's so much more surveillance these days, and technology means you're so much more powerful. And all the fact America can have 30,000 troops in a day.
Did he say that there was? Did he say that there was?
He said
we now have fewer troops stationed abroad than at any time since the 1920s. And that included the more recent surge against Iran to places like Saudi Arabia of a few months ago. Those are what are now being unwound.
That could technically be true, because there was during the Cold War, throughout the entirety of the Cold War, we still maintain, I think every single one, no, about every single one, we maintain all the most important U.S. bases that we took during World War II in Germany and Italy and other European countries. But up until 1989 or 1992, there were 500,000 U.S. soldiers stationed there at all times. That's now down to the tens of thousands. So that's probably technically true, but there's also no Soviet Union to sort of face off against anymore. We have all of these sort of fantasy conflicts that simply, even in the most fevered imaginings of the Rand Corporation, the Belfer Center, and the Pentagon, you can't conceive of a reason for there to be more of tens of thousands of troops. The mere tens of thousands of troops that we have in the Middle East right now are serving to successfully grind the entire region into poverty and misery.
Yeah.
The usual counterpoint when I point this out is isn't Dubai great? And it's just I'm sorry, but Gulf slave societies that exist expressly because the United States protected them to keep oil revenues out of the hands of the majority of the Arabs are not an argument for the success of the Middle East or Arabs. And
you've heard the thing about how the Burj Khalifa isn't even connected to the sewage system.
It isn't.
No, there's a whole thing. There's a big pile of lorries have to come, and they get filled up with sewage every day and then drive to the treatment plant.
Jesus Christ.
It would suggest that if they had to function in any normal way, it would collapse. Editing Rory here. It would seem that the Burj Khalifa has recently had its sewage system upgraded and has an internal sewage treatment system. But yes, until not that long ago, it did rely on a series of lorries removing all of the waste material on a daily basis.
It is truly atrocious. And like every time I see an Economist article about, oh, look how amazing the Gulf's doing, like Gulf lessons for Egypt, like who, like, and just this farcical fantasy that Saudi Arabia, a country of 35 million, is going to somehow be saved by setting up a Dubai analog, with what, 5 to 10 times as many people, or certainly 5 to 10 times as many citizens as the UAE has,
and significantly larger.
Yeah, it's what people have to point to. Like the successes of the Gulf monarchies are. I lose the ability to vocalize. It's so enraging. And yeah, it's just, we are the bad guys, and I think it's important to keep in mind the role that, it's almost like the people who are victimized, the people who are victimized the worst are the people we chose to be our enemies after we funded them, like as Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis. But allying with the United States has served these governments not at all. The rank humiliation of the Jordanian and Egyptian governments, who, the whole
and
point.
Libya.
Well, of course, Libya
further out of the Middle East, but it's still considered that with American tastes.
And Libya as well, because Libya made peace with the United States, and then we destroyed them. The whole point of Egypt's Camp David Accords in, I think, 78, 79, and Jordan's making peace with Israel in 1994, and also underlying the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Like the logic of all of these peace agreements was, we're going to make our peace with Israel and the United States, and in return, Palestinians will be protected. And just to see the full genocidal instincts of Israel unleashed over the past 18 months it's just another stage in the horrific humiliation of the region. I'm sorry to be such a downer, man, but like it's kind
America
of
in the Middle East. It's
yeah, it is kind of extraordinary. That
have you any lessons for like a country or a region to like get on the right side of America, or is it kind of America may arbitrarily just not like you?
Tunisia did absolutely everything it could to sort of set itself up as a democratic country to cater to what Europe and the United States claimed their interests were in the region, and got nothing for it. So yeah. Like in the Middle East, you're essentially hopeless. Don't get on the wrong side of the U.S.'s chosen sort of imperial garrison states. Like I perhaps Orban in Hungary should watch out. They should, their sort of performative anti-Ukrainian antics probably won't work out for them in the long run.
But also, what about the PKKs being told to sort of stand down? I know it's slightly further out with Turkey, but
I started seeing that news yesterday. We are broadcasting this we're recording this on February 27th, and this will be uploaded a couple weeks from now at this point. So I don't think anything we could say about the very fresh news. So essentially, the incarcerated leader of the PKK, the Kurdish revolutionary groups against
Workers' Party,
primarily rebelling against the Turkish state, but deeply, deeply affiliated with the SDF, the Syrian Kurds, has supposedly told everybody to stand down. How that's actually going to work in practice is anybody's guess at this point, but it is potentially the most hopeful thing that we've seen in the Middle East. We didn't really talk about Turkey's role at all in this episode, because primarily what we've been talking about is the humiliation of the Arabs. Turkey is sort of a great frenemy of the United States. Turkey is what honestly Egypt sort of seemed to be, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, which is a very militarily significant, very economically significant sort of member of the U.S. coalition that has differing agendas in some ways. The possibility of peace between Turkey and its Kurdish insurgency makes Turkey tremendously more powerful. And it's almost as if they have sort of they now kind of, especially now that Israel is taking over parts of southern Syria and the Syrian government desperately needs a greater power protector, Turkey has, to some extent, taken over Syria. So their antagonism to both the Kurds within Turkey and the Kurds within Syria is kind of like it gave them an excuse to be involved in Syria, but now they don't need that excuse anymore. Like, they kind of own Syria, so it's kind of in their interest, as they've, if you're thinking about this in a neo-Ottoman sense, they now have the Sunni Arabs of Syria, the classic heartland, Aleppo, Damascus, back eager to be under Turkish protection. Perhaps there can be a new negotiation that allows the Kurds, who have certainly had a disappointing number of decades, to say, okay, maybe we can come in under this Turkish coalition of protection.
And also considering their history with Donald Trump.
Yeah. And if Turkey can pull this off, that is tremendously positive for Syria, for Turkey, for the region, and not so great for Israel and the United States. So I wouldn't be super surprised if 2 days after this recording,
it all falls through.
It's all fallen to crap, and there's a new splinter section of the PKK that thinks Öcalan is a traitor and da-da-da. But even if everything goes as well as possible, I think Israel and the United States would be looking for ways to spoil this. I think it's a much broader question that we'll probably go into with a dedicated episode later on, this sort of burgeoning rivalry between Turkey and Israel over the wreckage that the United States has left in Iraq and Syria. I would, honestly, the main lesson of what's happened in the Middle East over the past 40 years is that maybe Turkey should try to stay out of it. Maybe Turkey should consolidate its control in northern Syria and, let Israel do what it wants in the south. That's obviously not a morally satisfying answer or something that's going to satisfy people who care about Palestine. But, it really seems like both screwing with and, both opposing and allying with the United States in this region been nightmarishly bad for everybody involved. I think Turkey would probably be best served by keeping as much distance as it possibly can from Israel. And I think Israel would be better served by keeping as much distance as it possibly can from Turkey. Of course, this is not a very satisfying answer to the Syrians that have won this great victory after a horrifying civil war, only to find themselves being divided up between Turks and Israelis. It is the potential of peace
it's
between
slightly optimistic. There's the potential for optimism.
Yes, but not really for Arabs or the Syrians but it's just extraordinary that people are still talking about the fall of the U.S. empire or the United States losing influence in the Middle East. We richly deserve to lose influence and power in the Middle East, yet we just get more and more powerful there, if only through the destruction of absolutely everything else.
And I know it's a bit further out, but there still might be an American war with Iran.
That's absolutely a strong possibility. It does seem, thankfully, frankly, Rory, it seems that the Trump administration is less interested in that war than the Biden administration was.
Well, some optimism.
That is something to be optimistic about. Yeah, that is something to be positive about. Donald Trump, but, basically only half of Donald Trump's cabinet are rampaging, bloodthirsty Zionists, as opposed to 100% in the Biden administration. I guess that's an improvement. I don't know. So we'll see.
So the Middle East, it's all America's fault.
That is my takeaway. And I think avoiding that or pretending that that's, oh wow, you're just a blame America guy. It's like in the Middle East, there's nobody else to blame because we've been in charge for a while.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.